She's unstable. She's always been unstable. And if you let her keep that child, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. That's what my mother-in-law said to the family mediator, out loud, with my son sitting in the next room eating crackers from a paper cup. I didn't respond. I just looked at my hands. People always mistake silence for weakness. That's been their first mistake with me, and it's never their last. My name is Avery. I'm 31 years old. I live in Hamilton, Ontario, and for the past 4 years, I built a career as a forensic auditor for a mid-sized firm that contracts with the Ontario Securities Commission. What that means, in plain language, is that I find money people have hidden. I am very good at my job. I have testified in court 11 times. I have never been wrong about a number. None of my in-laws knew any of this when we met. My ex-husband introduced me as Avery, she does accounting. That was technically true. They assumed I was the kind of person who reconciles expense reports in a beige cubicle. They were comfortable with that version of me. It was easier for them. My son's name is Oliver. He was turning 7. And the day of his birthday party, my entire family, my parents, my sister, my brother-in-law, my ex-husband's people, every single one of them chose to be somewhere else. I need to tell you how we got there. I met my ex-husband Marcus at a mutual friend's cottage near Muskoka. He was funny and warm, and he laughed with his whole body. His family had money, old money, the quiet kind from a grandfather who had developed commercial real estate across southern Ontario in the 80s. His mother, Patricia, I'll call her that because that's her name and she's earned it, had grown up with that money and had very specific ideas about what her son deserved. I was not it. She never said it directly. That wasn't her style. She said things like, "Oh, you rented in Stony Creek? How practical." She said things like, "Accounting must be so detail-oriented. I could never sit still that long." She said things like, "Oliver has your eyes, Avery. Poor little thing." I smiled every time. I was raised by a woman who survived worse, and I was not about to give Patricia the satisfaction of a reaction. Marcus and I were married for 4 years. The first 2 were good. The last 2 were the kind of bad that makes you question everything, including your own memory of the good. He worked in his family's property management company, which meant his mother was, functionally, always in the room. She had opinions about our apartment, our neighborhood, my hours, the daycare we chose for Oliver. When Oliver was 3, Marcus and I separated. We were mature about it at first. Shared custody, no lawyers. We said all the right things to each other, the ones people say when they're still hoping the other person will be reasonable. I should have hired a lawyer immediately. I didn't. I trusted the process. I trusted him. I trusted that because we both loved Oliver, we'd figure it out. Then Marcus started dating someone. I'll call her Vanessa. She was 26, and she was sweet enough in person. But she had been a friend of Patricia's niece, and within 3 months she was at every family dinner, every school pickup, every decision that used to involve 2 people and now involved 4. Patricia loved her. Of course she did. Vanessa asked for Patricia's opinion on things. She deferred to her. She wore the right clothes to the right events, and she never had opinions that inconvenienced anyone. I was not Vanessa. The shift started small. Marcus began requesting schedule changes at the last minute. He asked to take Oliver to his family's property in Prince Edward County the weekend of my colleague's wedding, a trip we hadn't discussed. He started communicating only through text, then only through a co-parenting app, which I later learned Patricia had suggested. I hired a lawyer. Her name was Christine, and she was 47 years old and had the kind of calm that comes from winning a lot. She looked at my documentation and said, "You've been very thorough." I told her that was my default mode. We went into mediation. That's where Patricia appeared, not as a party officially, but Marcus brought her to sit in the waiting room every single time, like a coach on the sideline. The mediator couldn't stop her from being there. I watched her through the glass partition, sitting perfectly straight, reading something on her phone. I said nothing. I documented everything. Oliver's 7th birthday was in late May. I had been planning it since February, a small party at a park near our apartment, the one with the spray pad that Oliver had been asking about since September. I invited 11 kids from his class, 2 families from our building, my parents, my sister and her husband, Marcus and Vanessa, and Marcus's sister, who I'll call Dana, because Dana had always been decent to me, and I believed in giving credit where it was due. Marcus confirmed he would be there. My parents confirmed. My sister confirmed. The week before the party, Marcus texted to say he couldn't make it. There was a charity golf tournament, a fundraiser for a foundation connected to his company. He sent a gift card for a children's bookstore in an e-transfer with the note, "Tell Ollie sorry." I read that 3 times, "Tell Ollie sorry." His son, turning 7. I texted back, "Oliver will be disappointed." That was all. 2 days later, my mother called. Her voice was strange, too careful, like she was reading from notes. She said that she and my father had decided to attend the same golf tournament, that it was an important community event, that she was sure Oliver would have a wonderful party. My father had been introduced to Patricia at Oliver's baptism. In 4 years, they had attended every birthday, Christmas, and school concert together. But now, apparently, a golf tournament had come up. I didn't say what I was thinking. I said, "I'll let Oliver know you can't make it." She paused. Then, "You don't have to make it a big deal, Avery." I hung up after we said goodbye, walked to my kitchen, and stood at the sink for a long time looking out the window at the parking lot below. My sister called that same afternoon. She and her husband had also been invited to the tournament. She said she'd make it up to Oliver. She said she'd take him to Canada's Wonderland when the weather got warmer. I said, "Sure, I'll let him know." Then I sat in Oliver's room after he went to sleep that night, and I thought about what to say to him when the people he expected to show up didn't. He had made a guest list on a piece of construction paper with a green marker. His grandparents were at the top. He'd drawn little faces next to each name. That piece of paper was on the refrigerator. I looked at it for a long time. The morning of the party, Oliver woke up early. He put on the shirt I'd bought him, navy blue with a small moose on the pocket, because that's what he'd chosen at the store. And he came to find me in the kitchen with his hair sticking up on one side and his eyes still half closed. "Is today?" he asked. "Today," I said. We set up the park together, Oliver and I and 2 friends who had shown up to help. We put up the banner, we filled the cooler, we set out the cake on the folding table, chocolate white icing, a hockey stick decoration on top, because Oliver had recently decided hockey was his entire personality. The kids arrived. 11 children in various states of sunscreen and sneakers, and Oliver was a different person the moment the first one showed up, running, laughing, completely himself in the way that only kids can be around other kids. It was a genuinely good party. Watching him, I felt something tighten and release in my chest at the same time. About an hour in, he came over to where I was standing and looked up at me. "Are Grammy and Grandpa coming?" he asked. I crouched down to his level. "Not today, bud. They had something come up." He thought about this. Did they forget? And there it was, 7 years old, trying to find the most generous possible explanation for the people he loved not showing up. Trying to give them an out they didn't deserve. "They didn't forget," I said. "They just had somewhere else to be." He looked at me for a moment, and then he nodded, and then he ran back to his friends. But I saw it, that small recalibration in his expression, the moment when a child quietly moves something from one column to another. I cut the cake and sang too loud and bought him an extra juice box, and I held it together perfectly for the rest of the afternoon. When we got home and he was asleep, and the leftover cake was wrapped in the fridge, I opened my laptop. I had been sitting on something for 6 months, a file. A discrepancy in the corporate structure of the family's property management company that I had noticed completely by accident while reviewing some documents Marcus had shared with me during an earlier mediation session. Documents he'd included to demonstrate the value of certain assets. He hadn't realized what was in them. People never think accountants spread for pleasure. I do. What I had found was not small. It wasn't the kind of thing you stumble across and then forget about. It was the kind of thing that, if it reached the right desk, would be very professionally consequential for several people. I had sat on it because I was still trying to be reasonable. I was still trying not to be the person who burned things down. But that night I thought about Oliver asking if they forgot. I thought about my mother saying, "You don't have to make it a big deal." I opened the file. I spent 2 hours documenting everything carefully, the way I do at work, the way I have always done, citations and timestamps, and a clean, logical chain from evidence to conclusion. Then I did something I had never done before with information I'd gathered in a personal context. I forwarded it to the OSC's online tip portal, anonymous, complete, attached to nothing with my name on it. Then I transferred $1.25 to my mother's account, the amount she owed me from a coffee I'd bought her 3 months ago, with the note, "Happy to settle all outstanding accounts." And then I went to bed. What happened next took about 8 weeks to fully develop, the way these things do when regulators are involved. I knew the timeline because I know how these processes work. I knew the first contact would come by registered letter. I knew the company's accountants would be given a window to respond. I knew what would happen if the response was inadequate. It was inadequate. I found out third hand through Christine, my lawyer, who heard it from the opposing counsel during an unrelated call about our custody schedule. Opposing counsel, a man named Richard, had mentioned that the family was dealing with a regulatory matter. He said it the way people do when they're trying to make something sound smaller than it is. Christine told me with a perfectly neutral expression and then waited for my reaction. I said, "That's unfortunate timing for them." She looked at me for 3 seconds longer than necessary and then moved on. The custody proceedings resumed 6 weeks later. By this point, something had shifted in the room. Marcus arrived without Patricia. For the first time in 14 months, the waiting room chair where she always sat was empty. Marcus looked tired and careful. Vanessa was not there either. Richard, his lawyer, opened by requesting a delay in the proceedings due to, and I quote, "unforeseen business circumstances affecting the respondent's family." Christine leaned back slightly and said, "My client is willing to discuss a reasonable timeline. However, we'd like to move forward on the matter of primary residency today, given that this has been pending for over a year and the child's stability should take priority." The mediator agreed. Marcus did not get primary residency. He got the schedule we should have agreed to 14 months ago, the one he had initially rejected because, I later understood, Patricia had told him he should push for more. Generous visitation, shared holidays, clear communication protocols, reasonable, what it always should have been. At one point during the session, Richard attempted to raise a point about my work obligations affecting my availability as a parent. Christine had anticipated this. She placed 3 documents on the table, my employment record, 2 letters of professional commendation, and a note from Oliver's school highlighting his consistent attendance and academic engagement under my primary care. Richard looked at the documents. Then he looked at me. Christine said very quietly, "Counsel, do you have any further questions about my client's professional standing?" He did not. We finalized everything before 4 p.m. I picked Oliver up from aftercare and we walked home, and he told me about a game he'd invented on the playground involving a stick and a specific rock and rules that changed every few minutes. I listened to the whole thing. It was a very good game. My mother called 2 weeks after the proceedings. She started with small talk, weather, a neighbor's renovation, and I let her get through it. Then she said, Avery, I want you to know that your father and I were put in a difficult position this spring. I said, I know. She said, Patricia had mentioned that it might be better for Oliver's stability if you and Marcus could come to an agreement without everything becoming adversarial. I said, I understand she felt that way. Long pause. We should have come to his party, she said. Yes, I said, you should have. She asked if she could take Oliver for a weekend. I told her I'd check with him first because he was 7 and his feelings about his grandparents were his own to manage now. That was a new rule I had made quietly, in my own head, on the afternoon of the park party when I watched him recalibrate. My sister called a few days after. She'd heard about the regulatory investigation. She asked if I knew anything about it. I said I really couldn't speak to that. She asked how Oliver was doing. I told her he was great. I told her he'd scored his first goal at hockey camp the previous Saturday, and that she could see the video on my phone if she wanted to come by sometime. She came by. She watched the video 4 times. Oliver barely acknowledged her when he got home from school, but by the end of the evening they were playing cards on the living room floor, and he was explaining the rules of his playground game to her in complete and slightly unhinged detail. Kids recalibrate. Then, eventually, given enough consistency from the adults who do show up, they find their way back. I don't talk to Patricia. That's not a decision I made dramatically. There was no confrontation, no final speech. I simply stopped making space. There are people who take up the space you give them, and when you stop giving it, they have nowhere to stand. She had nowhere to stand. She had nowhere to stand. Marcus and I co-parent. It's not warm, but it's functional, and it's getting better very slowly in the way that things do when there's no longer a third party with opinions in the waiting room. He took Oliver to a Leafs game in October, and apparently they had a genuinely good time, and Oliver came home and told me every detail of every goal, and I listened to all of it. That's the thing about doing this right. It's not for Marcus, it's not for my parents or my sister, or for any version of this story where I look good. It's for Oliver and the specific kind of kid he's turning into, the one who still invents games on the playground, who gives the people he loves the most generous explanation available, who moves things between columns quietly and doesn't make a show of it. He gets that from me, I think. Last month, for his 8th birthday, my parents came. My sister came. We had the party at the same park. Same spray pad, different cake. Lemon this time because Oliver had changed his mind about chocolate, which he does about most things because he's 8. He made another guest list on construction paper. He didn't draw faces next to the names this time. He just wrote them down, very quickly, like it was a formality, like of course everyone was coming, like it was already settled. And it was. I think about Oliver's face a lot. That moment at the park when he looked up at me and asked if they forgot. He wasn't crying. He wasn't angry. He was just trying to make the math work in a way that didn't hurt anyone. 7 years old and already doing the emotional labor that most adults never get around to. That's what I carry with me from all of this. Not the regulatory file, not the custody schedule, not the look on Richard's face when Christine put those documents on the table. It's that moment. A kid in a navy shirt with a moose on the pocket, quietly moving something from one column to another. I used to think that doing the right thing was its own immediate reward, that being patient and documented and calm would somehow make things move faster. It doesn't. Being principled is slow work. Patricia had been undermining me for 4 years before anything shifted. My parents had been drifting toward her orbit for 2 of those years, and I had watched it happen and said nothing because I believed, genuinely believed, that reasonable people would eventually see clearly. What I learned is that clarity comes on its own timeline, not yours. You can't rush someone into seeing what they're not ready to see. What you can do is keep your own record clean. Not for leverage. I didn't forward that file as a weapon. I forwarded it because it was the right thing to do with information I had, full stop. But because integrity compounds quietly over time the way damage does. Marcus wasn't a bad person. He was a person who had never been required to think independently, because there had always been someone in the waiting room with opinions. When that person was no longer there, something in him settled. It took 14 months in a regulatory investigation and the humbling experience of sitting across from a mediator without his mother beside him, but it happened. People can change when the conditions finally ask them to. I think about that when I'm frustrated with someone. What conditions would need to shift for this person to see differently? Sometimes the answer is nothing you can control. Sometimes it just takes time and consequence and enough quiet from you that they can finally hear themselves think. The intelligence part, the careful documentation, the understanding of how systems work, the knowing which file to forward and when, that protected Oliver in a way that anger never could have. Anger would have gotten me a reputation and lost me the case. Clarity got me the schedule and my son's stability. But none of it would have meant anything without the willingness to keep going through the parts that were genuinely hard. The months when I didn't know how it would resolve. The nights when Oliver was asleep and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, wondering if I had made the right call at every single decision point. Resilience is not a feeling. It's a practice. You do the next right thing when you don't know if it's working, and then you do it again. Oliver made a guest list this year without drawing faces beside the names. He just wrote them down, matter of fact, because of course everyone was coming. He learned that from watching what happens when you don't give up on the people worth keeping and quietly stop making room for the ones who chose not to show up. I'm still learning it too,